I heard the engine before I saw the headlights, that low aggressive hum rolling across my land like it owned the place. And I remember thinking, not again, not a sixth time this week, not at 6:12 in the morning when the air still smelled like cold dirt and cedar and everything was supposed to be quiet. Then came the crack, sharp and splintering, with snapping like it was nothing, followed by the metallic groan of hinges giving up. And just like that, her white SUV pushed through my ranch gate. Like it was a suggestion instead of a boundary, gravel spraying under her tires, dust rising in the pale Texas sunrise, and she didn't even slow down, didn't hesitate, just drove straight across my property like it was her personal shortcut, like the last dozen warnings, the repairs, the signs, the conversations meant absolutely nothing. I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching the tire tracks carve fresh lines through land I paid for, land I rebuilt after everything fell apart 2 years ago. And that was the moment it finally clicked. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, and patterns can be studied, mapped, and eventually stopped. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 38, and I bought this 12-acre ranch outside Austin after a divorce that took more than just a house. This place was supposed to be quiet, a reset, something solid I could fix with my own hands, board by board, post by post, something nobody could just take from me. Again, but 3 months after I moved in, the HOA from the neighboring subdivision decided my back gate looked a lot like a convenient shortcut to their main road. And leading that idea was Brenda Whitmore, HOA president, real estate agent, the kind of woman who smiles like she's doing you a favor while stepping over your boundaries. She drove a white luxury SUV that always looked freshly polished, like it had never touched real dirt, which made it almost funny watching it cut across my pasture. Like it belonged there, except it wasn't funny. Not when I'd already replaced that gate 4 times. Not when I'd installed cameras, posted signs, even had a surveyor confirm exactly where my property lines sat. Clear as day, no easement, no shared access, just my land, my gate, and her. Ignoring all of it. I tried doing things the right way. I really did. I talked to her, calmly, explained the boundary, showed her the documents, and she just tilted her head and said something about community flow and shared benefit. Like those words meant more than a deed. Like confidence could rewrite property lines, and every time I fixed the gate, she came back through it. A little faster, a little more certain. Like she was testing how far she could push before I pushed back. That morning, as the dust settled and the broken wood hung crooked off the hinges, I looked at the camera mounted on the post, still blinking red, still recording everything. And I realized something that changed the way I handled all of it. I wasn't dealing with someone who needed to be convinced. I was dealing with someone who needed to be stopped. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't see yet, was that I had already stopped reacting and started building something she would never be able to drive through again. I built this place one post at a time. And I remember the first morning I woke up here, the way the light came over the back ridge and hit the fence line just right, turning the dust in the air into something almost golden, and for a second it felt like I finally owned something that could not be taken away from me. The ranch is 12 acres of uneven ground just outside Austin, not the kind of land developers fight over, but the kind you earn, with stubborn patches of cedar, a shallow drainage line that only fills when the rain gets serious, and a gravel drive that crunches under your tires like it is reminding you that you are home. And every inch of it matters to me, because I put my hands on all of it, repaired the old fencing, reset the posts, hung that gate myself with steel brackets I welded in my own workshop, because I used to be a contractor, the kind who specializes in foundations and load-bearing structures, the kind of work nobody notices until it fails, and I have seen what happens when something is built wrong or ignored for too long. It does not just break, it collapses at the worst possible moment. After the divorce, I needed something solid, something that did not argue back, something that did not change its mind overnight. So I sold what was left of my business, took what I had, and bought this land from an older rancher who looked me in the eye and said, "Take care of it, and it will take care of you." And I believed him. I still do. Because out here things are simple, boundaries are real, and respect is not optional. It is expected. That is why the first time I saw tire tracks cutting across my back pasture, it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like a warning. Because tracks do not just appear, they are made by someone choosing a path. And when I followed those tracks, they led straight to that back gate. the one that sits right along the line where my property touches the edge of Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood that looks clean and organized from the outside, but runs on a different kind of logic, one where rules seem to bend depending on who is enforcing them. I learned quickly who that was, because Brenda Whitmore made sure of it. She introduced herself the second week I moved in, stepping out of that white SUV like she was arriving at a showing, sunglasses on, phone in hand, smiling like we were already on the same page, and she talked about community standards, property values, shared access, all the things that sound reasonable until you realize none of them apply to land that is not part of her association. And I told her that politely. I showed her the survey, the deed, the line marked, clear as day, and she nodded like she understood, like it was settled, and for about 3 days it was quiet, until the tracks came back, deeper this time, cutting the same line, straighter, more confident, and that is when I installed the first camera, mounted high on the post, angled just right to catch the approach, and the next morning I watched the footage with the smell of fresh coffee and saw her SUV roll up, pause for half a second, then push through like the gate was nothing more than an inconvenience. And that was the moment I realized something about Brenda Whitmore. She was not guessing. She was not confused. She was testing limits, and every time nothing stopped her, those limits moved a little further, a little faster, until eventually there would not be a gate left to fix. And I have spent too many years fixing things that should have been built right the first time to let that happen again. Brenda Whitmore did not raise her voice when she talked to you. And that was the first thing I noticed. Because people who know they are right usually do not need to lower their tone to make a point. But Brenda spoke like everything she said was already decided, like the conversation was just a formality you had to go through before agreeing with her. And she always stood just a little too close, perfume sharp and expensive, sunglasses resting on her head, even in the shade, phone in her hand, like it was a badge of authority. She was in her early 50s, perfectly put together, the kind of person who looked like she had never fixed anything in her life, but knew exactly how everything should look. And she had been the president of Willow Creek Estates for 3 years, long enough to turn a homeowners association into something that felt less like a community and more like a system she controlled. And you could see it in the way people reacted when her SUV rolled down their street. Garage doors closing a little faster, conversations cutting short, heads turning just enough to track where she went without making it obvious. The first time she stepped onto my property after I installed the camera, she did not even glance at it, did not ask permission, just walked up to the broken gate like she was inspecting a listing and ran her hand along the splintered wood, shaking her head like I had disappointed her. And she said, "You really should consider upgrading this entrance. It is not up to community standards." And I remember the way the wind moved through the cedar behind her, the dry rustle mixing with the faint hum of her idling engine. And I told her, as clearly as I could, "This is not your community. This is private property." And she smiled, not wide, just enough to show she heard me and chose not to care. And she said, "Everything connects eventually. Ethan, you will see. People need access." And then she turned and got back into that SUV. Like the conversation was over, like she had just explained something obvious to me. What made it worse was how consistent she was. Every morning around the same time, same approach, same slight pause before the gate, like she was checking to see if anything had changed, and when it had not, she would drive through without hesitation, sometimes alone, sometimes followed by another car from the subdivision, like she was proving a point to someone else, and each time the damage got a little worse. Hinges bending, posts loosening, the wood cracking in new places, and I could feel that familiar pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something is wrong but the usual ways of fixing it are not working. I started paying attention to more than just the gate. I watched the timing, the pattern, the way she angled the vehicle slightly to the left to avoid the deeper rut near the drainage line, the way she accelerated just before impact so the gate would give without too much resistance. It was not reckless. It was practiced, like she had done it enough times to understand exactly how much force it took to get through without stopping. And that told me everything I needed to know about her. Brenda Whitmore did not see boundaries as fixed lines. She saw them as obstacles that could be adjusted with enough persistence. And she believed that because no one had stopped her before, no one ever would. And standing there watching another set of fresh tracks cut across my land, listening to the fading hum of her engine disappear toward the subdivision, I realized I was not just dealing with a neighbor who did not respect a fence. I was dealing with someone who had built her entire sense of control on the idea that rules only mattered when she enforced them. And that kind of thinking does not change with a conversation. It only changes when it finally meets something that does not move. The next week is when it stopped being just her, and that is when I knew it was about to get worse, because one set of tire tracks is a problem, but multiple sets mean someone is giving permission, and sure enough, by Thursday morning, there were 3 different vehicles cutting across my pasture, all following the same line like it had been mapped out for them. Tires pressing the ground into a hard-packed strip that did not belong there, turning grass into dust and dust into a road that had never been part of this land. I could hear them before I saw them now. Engines overlapping, the low rumble of trucks mixed with the higher pitch of smaller cars, and every time they hit that gate there was that same sequence of sounds. The brief pause, the push, the splintering crack, the hinges protesting, and then the rush of gravel as they came through. And it did not matter how many times I fixed it, replaced the posts with thicker ones, reinforced the latch, added a steel brace behind the wood. They adjusted, came in at a slightly different angle, a little more speed, just enough to break through again without stopping. I remember one afternoon standing at the fence line with the sun high overhead, heat rising off the ground in waves, watching a pickup truck follow Brenda through the gate like it was a guided tour, and she did not even look back, did not check if it was okay. Just assumed that if she could do it, everyone else could too. And that assumption spread faster than anything I could repair. I tried documenting everything, dates, times, license plates when I could catch them on camera, building a record like I used to on job sites when something kept failing and you needed proof it was not a one-time issue. And I took that record to the county office, sat in a chair that smelled faintly of old paper and air conditioning, explaining the situation to someone who nodded politely and told me it sounded like a civil matter, something between neighbors, something that would need to be resolved privately. And I walked out of there with the same problem I walked in with, just written down in cleaner language. Even the sheriff who stopped by after I called it and once stood there looking at the broken gate, boots shifting in the gravel, and said unless there was clear signage, and repeated. Notice, it was complicated, and I pointed to the sign I had already installed, white background, bold black letters, private property, no trespassing, mounted right on the post at eye level, and he nodded again, but did not commit to anything. Like the situation itself made him uncomfortable. That night I sat at my workbench, the smell of metal and oil hanging in the air, hands resting on tools I had not used in weeks, and I watched the footage again, frame by frame, not just the impact, but everything leading up to it, the approach, the angle, the speed, the confidence. And I realized something that shifted everything in my head. I had been treating the gate like the problem, something to fix, something to reinforce, but the gate was not the problem. It was just the point of contact. The real issue was the assumption behind every one of those tire tracks, the belief that nothing on this land would truly stop them. By the time the sun came up the next morning, lighting up the dust and the broken wood like it had every day that week, I was no longer thinking about how to repair what they were breaking. I was thinking about how to change what they expected to happen when they hit that gate, because this was not a small disagreement anymore. This was a system that had formed without permission, and systems do not disappear on their own. They have to be designed out of existence. I tried doing it the official way first, because that is what you are supposed to do when something crosses a line. You document it, you report it, you give the system a chance to work. So I printed everything out, every frame from the camera, every date and time stamped down to the second, tire tracks measured in inches across the same stretch of dirt, patterns that showed repetition, not accident. And I drove into town with a folder thick enough to feel like evidence, the kind that should mean something when you put it on a desk. The office smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long, fluorescent lights humming overhead. And I remember sliding those papers across to a clerk who flipped through them slowly, nodding in that careful way people do when they understand the problem, but are already thinking about how it fits into a category that does not require action. And she told me I could file a complaint, maybe pursue a civil claim, maybe hire an attorney. And each of those words felt like more time, more money, more waiting, while the problem outside kept moving every single morning. I did talk to a lawyer, sat across from a man in a clean office with framed certificates on the wall, and he looked through the documents, adjusted his glasses, and told me I had a strong case, clear property line, no recorded easement, repeated trespass, but then he mentioned timelines, filings, hearings, and the number he quoted just to get started was enough to make me lean back in that chair and stare at the ceiling for a second, because I had not bought this land to spend the next year fighting for it in a courtroom. Even the HOA meeting I attended did not go the way I thought it would. I walked into a room full of folding chairs and polite smiles, the air thick with that artificial sense of order, and when I brought it up, calmly, directly, Brenda did not deny it. She reframed it, talked about community access, about how the previous owner had been cooperative, about how it benefited everyone. And people nodded, not because they had seen my side, but because they trusted the person who had been speaking to them the longest, and I could feel the shift in the room, the way the problem stopped being about a gate and started being about me resisting something they had already accepted. I left that meeting with the same folder in my hand, edges worn now, paper softer from being handled, and when I got back to the ranch the sun was already dropping, casting long shadows across the pasture. And there it was again, the gate hanging uneven, fresh marks in the dirt, another set of tracks cutting through like nothing had changed while I was gone. I remember standing there with the evening air cooling off, the smell of dust settling, and feeling that familiar frustration, not loud, not explosive, just steady, like a pressure that does not go away, because I had followed every step I was supposed to follow. I had explained, documented, reported, and still nothing had shifted, not for them, not for Brenda, not for anyone using that path. That was the moment I understood something simple but important. I was asking a system that moved slowly to fix a problem that moved every morning, and those two speeds do not match. They never have. So waiting was not a solution, and arguing was not a solution, because neither of those things changed what happened when a vehicle met that gate. I set the folder down on my workbench that night, next to tools I trusted more than paperwork, and I looked at the footage one more time, not as evidence, not as proof, but as information, as data, angles, speeds, distances, materials. And for the first time since this started, the frustration eased just enough for something else to take its place, something quieter, more focused, because I was done trying to stop them with words, and I was done trying to keep repairing something they expected to break. And once that decision settled in, clear and steady, everything else started to line up in a way that made a lot more sense. Once I stopped trying to fight it the usual way, everything became quieter, not outside, because the engine still came every morning and the gates still broke the same way, but inside my head, because now I was not reacting anymore. I was studying it. And there is a difference between those two things that most people never notice. I started measuring distances with a tape instead of guessing, walking the line from the approach point to the gate, marking where the tires first touched my side of the property, noting how the ground dipped just slightly about 12 feet before the gate, enough to shift weight forward when a vehicle accelerated. And that detail mattered more than anything I had tried before, because force is not just about speed. It is about where that speed transfers. I went back through the footage again, slowing it down frame by frame, watching the exact moment the front tires met the wood, the slight lift in the suspension, the angle of impact, and I could almost feel it through the screen. The way the structure failed not because it was weak, but because it was designed to give under the kind of repeated stress she was applying. And that was when I realized I had been building the wrong kind of barrier. I had been building something meant to resist politely, something meant to flex and recover, when what I actually needed was something that did not acknowledge impact at all. I spent the next 2 days out in the workshop, with the doors open, Texas heat pushing in, the smell of cut metal and dust mixing in the air, pulling out materials I had not used since I left my contracting business, steel lengths, concrete mix, brackets that were never meant to be seen once installed, and I started sketching it out on a piece of scrap plywood, not a wall you could see from the road, not something that would turn into another argument or another complaint, but a structure hidden in plain sight, something that looked exactly like what they expected until it was not. The key was alignment, placing the reinforcement exactly where her vehicle met the gate every single time, not where it might, but where it always did, because patterns are predictable if you pay attention long enough, and I had more than enough data to know her line was consistent within inches. I also made sure of something else, something just as important as the structure itself. I checked the regulations again, walked the boundary with the survey in hand, confirmed every measurement, every inch of placement, and I installed a new sign. Same words as before, but larger, clearer, positioned at the exact height a driver could not miss if they were paying attention, because I was not interested in creating a problem for myself later. I wanted everything to be as clear as the line in the dirt she kept crossing. By the third evening, I had the base set. Concrete poured below grade where no one would ever see it. Steel anchored deep enough that it became part of the ground itself. And above it, I rebuilt the gate exactly the way it had looked before. Same wood, same color, same spacing. Even left a slight imperfection in one of the boards because that is how it had been the last time she broke through it. And details like that matter when someone thinks they understand what they are about to hit. I stepped back at dusk, the sky turning that muted orange that settles over the pasture, and looked at it from the approach angle. And there was nothing different, nothing that would make anyone slow down or reconsider. Just another gate on a ranch road. Just another piece of wood waiting to give way. And that was exactly the point, because by then I was not trying to stop her with a warning or a repair. I was letting her bring the same expectation she had built over weeks of doing this, straight into something that was not going to respond the way she thought it would. The next morning, I did not stand at the gate. I stayed back near the workshop with the door half open, the smell of metal still hanging in the air from the night before, coffee in my hand gone untouched again, and I watched everything through the camera feed instead of with my own eyes, because distance gives you a different kind of clarity. The sun had barely started to lift over the ridge, light cutting across the pasture in long, thin lines. And for a moment, everything looked exactly the way it had the day I bought the place, quiet, untouched, like nothing had ever crossed that boundary. And then right on schedule I heard it. That same engine, steady, confident, approaching without hesitation, and even through the screen I could recognize it before the vehicle came into view, because patterns do not just live in movement, they live in sound too. Brenda's SUV rolled into frame, white paint catching the early light, slowing just slightly as it always did about 15 feet from the gate. That brief pause she had trained herself into, not to stop, just to confirm nothing had changed, and from where I stood, I could almost feel that moment of decision. That split second where she expected the same outcome she had gotten every time before. She did not get out, did not look around, did not even glance at the sign that was now impossible to miss. Bold letters clear against the wood. She just eased forward, lined up with that same angle she had used for weeks, tires settling into the path she had carved into my land like it belonged there. And then she pressed the accelerator. What happened next did not look dramatic. There was no sudden chaos. No exaggerated reaction, just a very simple shift in expectation. The front of her vehicle met the gate exactly where it always had. Same point, same height, same approach, but instead of the wood giving way and the hinges bending like they had before, everything held, solid, unmoving, like it had always been part of the ground. And the motion stopped right there, clean, immediate, like hitting a line that does not move. I watched the footage twice in real time before I even blinked, because what stood out was not the impact, it was the stillness after, the way the dust settled without that usual burst of debris, the way the gate stayed exactly where it was supposed to be, no shift, no break, no give, and for the first time since this started, the pattern broke. She sat there for a moment, engine still running, and even through the camera I could see the hesitation, the slight movement inside the vehicle. Like she was trying to understand why something that had always worked suddenly did not. And that was the point, not to surprise her, not to shock her, but to remove the assumption she had built everything on, because without that assumption, the rest of it does not hold together. She backed up slowly, adjusted the angle, tried again with less speed this time, more caution, and the result was the same. The gate did not acknowledge it, did not respond. It just existed exactly where it was supposed to. And that second attempt told me everything I needed to know, because this was no longer about habit. It was about reality setting in. By the time she put the vehicle in reverse again and turned it around, leaving the way she came instead of crossing through, the pasture looked untouched, the gate stood straight, and the line she had carved into my land ended right where it should have ended from the beginning, and standing there in the quiet that followed, with the engine sound fading into the distance, I realized this was the first morning in weeks where nothing on my property had been changed without my permission. The quiet did not last as long as I expected, because patterns do not disappear overnight. They hesitate, they test, and then they either adapt or collapse. And the next morning I was back at the same spot near the workshop, camera feed open, coffee cooling in my hand, waiting to see which way this one would go. The sun came up the same way it always did, soft light spreading across the pasture, catching the edges of the fence line. And for a few minutes nothing moved, no engine, no dust, just the sound of wind moving through the cedar, and the faint creak of the gate settling into its hinges, solid now in a way it had never been before. And then I heard it again, but this time it was slower, less certain, the engine note different, like whoever was behind the wheel was not entirely sure what they were about to find. Brenda's SUV came into view, but she did not drive straight up to the gate like before. She stopped about 20 feet back, just sat there for a moment, and I could almost picture her looking at it, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she expected, because visually nothing had changed, same wood, same posts, same alignment. But something in her timing was off, and timing is everything when you are used to getting the same result. She inched forward this time, not the confident approach from before, more of a test, tires rolling slowly into the path she had worn into the ground. And when she reached that same point of contact, she stopped completely, engine idling, and that was new, because she had never stopped there before, never needed to. And for a second it looked like she might get out, like she might actually walk up and check it, but she did not. She stayed in the vehicle, hesitating, and then after a few seconds she turned the wheel slightly and backed away, choosing not to try again. That hesitation spread faster than anything else had, because by the third day no other vehicles followed her path. No second car trailing behind, no pickup cutting across the pasture, just the empty line in the dirt leading up to a gate that now meant what it was supposed to mean. And I could see it in the footage, the absence of movement where there had been constant motion, the way the dust stayed settled instead of being kicked up every morning. And it felt different, not like a victory, not loud or obvious, but like something had finally aligned the way it should have from the start. Later that week I saw her again, not from the camera this time, but from across the fence line, near the edge of her subdivision, standing with another homeowner, pointing in the direction of my property. And even from that distance I could recognize the posture, the controlled gestures, the way she explained things. Like she was still in charge of the situation, but she never stepped onto my land again, never approached that gate. And that told me more than anything she could have said. I kept everything running the same way, cameras on, signs visible, structure unchanged, because consistency matters once a new pattern is established. And over the next few days the ground began to heal in its own way. The hard-packed strips softening slightly under the wind and occasional rain, edges of grass pushing back in where they could, and the line that had once looked like a road started to fade back into what it had been before, just part of the pasture. I still reviewed the footage every evening out of habit, the glow of the screen lighting up the workshop, the quiet hum of the equipment replacing the noise that used to come from outside, and each empty frame confirmed the same thing. The system that had formed without permission had finally broken, not because it was argued against or reported, but because it no longer worked. And when something stops working the way people expect, they stop relying on it. And that is how you end something that words could not reach. By the end of that week, something unexpected happened, not outside on the land, but in the way people started approaching me. Because when a pattern breaks, word travels faster than the pattern ever did. And it started small. A pickup slowing down on the county road that runs along the front of my property. A driver leaning out just enough to look toward the back fence line like they were trying to confirm something they had heard. And then one afternoon, an older neighbor from a few lots down the road stopped by, boots dusty, hat pulled low, the kind of man who does not waste words. And he stood there by the gate for a moment, running his hand along the wood, tapping it lightly like he was checking for something only he could feel. And then he looked at me and said, "You finally fixed it." And there was something in the way he said it that told me he had been watching the whole thing unfold without ever stepping in. We talked for a while, not about Brenda directly, but about land, about how lines used to mean something. Out here, how once a boundary was set, it stayed set, not because of paperwork, but because people respected it. And he mentioned that the previous owner had never allowed anyone through that gate, not once, which confirmed what I had already found in the deed and survey. But hearing it from someone who had lived next to it for years made it feel more solid, like the history of the place had been restored along with the structure. A couple days later, another neighbor stopped by, younger, curious. asking if I had done something different to the gate because people in the subdivision were talking about it, about how it suddenly did not open up the way it used to, and I kept my answer simple. Told him it was built to stay where it was supposed to stay, nothing more, nothing less, because the truth did not need to be complicated, it just needed to be consistent. Even the mail carrier mentioned it in passing. A quick comment about how quiet the back stretch had become, how they no longer saw dust rising every morning from that direction, and each of these small interactions added up to something bigger than I expected, because it was not just about stopping one person anymore. It was about resetting an understanding that had been slipping. I did not change anything about the setup. The gate stayed exactly the same. The sign remained clear and visible. The cameras kept recording. Because consistency is what makes a boundary real over time, and I wanted there to be no confusion about where that line was or what it meant. I also went back through all my documentation, not because I needed it anymore for the immediate problem, but because I wanted a complete record, before and after, the pattern and the break, the evidence of how something forms and how it ends, and I stored it away in the same folder that had once felt like my only option, except now it felt more like a backup than a solution. The land itself kept settling into its natural rhythm, the faint track that had once cut across the pasture softening more each day, edges blending back into the surrounding ground. And every time I walked that line, I could feel the difference under my boots, the way the surface no longer held that hard, packed resistance, but gave slightly, like it was returning to what it had always been before it was forced into something else. I saw Brenda one more time that week, at a distance, standing near the entrance to her subdivision, talking to a small group, gestures controlled, posture still confident. But there was a gap now between her and my property, a space she did not cross, and that space told me everything I needed to know, because whatever she believed before, whatever assumption had carried her across my land day after day, it no longer applied, and without that assumption, the rest of it had nothing to stand on. The quiet held, but I did not mistake it for the end, because when something like that shifts, there is always a moment where it tries to come back, not in the same way, but in a different form, something that tests whether the change is real or temporary. And about 10 days after everything stopped, I saw it on the camera again, not the usual approach, not the confident straight line, but something slower, more deliberate. Brenda's SUV pulling up to the gate and stopping well short this time. Engine idling. No immediate move forward, just sitting there like she was measuring something. I watched from the workshop, the faint hum of the equipment behind me blending with the low idle coming through the speakers. And for a minute nothing happened, just that still frame of her vehicle facing a gate that had not moved in over a week. And then the driver's side door opened, and she stepped out for the first time since this started, heels pressing into the dirt carefully like she was not used to uneven ground. Sunglasses in place even though the light was soft, and she walked up to the gate slowly, not with the same confidence she had before, but with something closer to caution. She ran her hand along the wood again, the same motion she had made weeks ago, but this time it lingered, fingers pressing slightly, testing, and I could tell she was trying to understand what had changed without anything actually looking different. And that is the kind of problem people like her do not like. Something they cannot see or immediately explain. She glanced at the sign, read it this time. I could see the slight tilt of her head, the pause, and then she stepped back, looking at the ground, at the path that had once been so clear, now softened, less defined, like it was already fading from memory, and for a second I thought she might try again, get back in and push forward like before, but she did not. She stayed there, standing on my side of the fence line without crossing it, caught between what she had done and what she now understood. I walked out then, not quickly, not with any urgency, just steady, boots pressing into the same ground she had driven over so many times, and I stopped a few feet away, close enough for a conversation, but far enough to keep the boundary clear, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The air still, the only sound the faint ticking of her engine cooling. She finally spoke, voice measured, asking if I had reinforced the gate, like it was a technical question, like this was still a matter of upgrades and adjustments. And I told her it was built to match the property line, nothing more, nothing less. And she held my gaze for a second longer than before, searching for something, maybe an explanation, maybe a way to reframe it the way she had at that meeting. But there was nothing to reframe, No opening to turn it into something else. She nodded once, a small movement, and stepped back toward her vehicle. And that was the closest thing to acknowledgement I was ever going to get. Not an apology, not an admission, just a shift in behavior that matched reality. When she drove away that day, she did not come back the next morning or the one after that, and the gate remained exactly where it was supposed to be, not because I had argued for it, not because I had convinced anyone, but because I had built something that aligned with the truth of the land. And once that alignment is there, everything else either adjusts or stays away. The change did not come with a big announcement or some dramatic moment that everyone could point to. It came quietly, the kind of shift you only notice if you have been paying attention from the beginning. And over the next couple of weeks, the entire rhythm of that area settled into something new, something closer to what it had been before all of this started. And I found myself walking the property in the evenings again, not checking for damage, not looking for fresh tracks, but just walking, boots pressing into soil that no longer felt compacted and forced, the air carrying that dry cedar scent instead of dust kicked up by tires. The gate became just a gate again, not a problem to fix, not a point of conflict, just a boundary that stayed where it was supposed to stay. And there was something about that simplicity that felt heavier than any argument I could have made, because it did not rely on anyone agreeing with me. It just existed, consistent and unmoving. I still kept the cameras running, still reviewed the footage out of habit more than necessity, the soft glow of the screen lighting up the workshop at night, and each empty frame where there used to be movement reinforced the same thing, that the pattern had not just paused, it had ended. Word kept circulating in small ways. Neighbors mentioning how access had changed, how people from the subdivision were now using their own roads again instead of cutting across my land. And there was a tone to those conversations that felt different, less like curiosity and more like understanding, like something had been corrected without needing to be explained in detail. Even the HOA seemed to adjust, not publicly, not with any kind of statement, but in the absence of action. No more attempts to justify the path, no more conversations about shared access, just a quiet shift back to where things should have been from the start. And that told me more than any meeting ever could. Because when something stops being pushed, it usually means the people behind it know they no longer have ground to stand on. I saw Brenda a few times after that, always at a distance, always on her side of the line, still composed, still carrying herself like she was in control. But there was a difference in how she oriented herself. Around that boundary, a space she did not approach anymore. And that space was not created by words or warnings. It was created by something she could not move through the way she once had. I never took the gate down, never changed its appearance, because that was never the point. The point was not to make a statement. It was to make a reality that matched what had always been true about the land. And once that reality was in place, everything else aligned with it naturally. Some evenings I would stand near that post where the camera was mounted, listening to the quiet stretch out across the pasture. No engines, no crunch of gravel out of place. Just wind moving through the trees and the occasional sound of something small in the brush. And I would think about how easily all of this could have continued if I had kept approaching it the same way, fixing what broke instead of changing why it broke. And that thought stayed with me longer than anything else, because it was not just about a gate or a neighbor or a piece of land. It was about understanding that some problems do not need more resistance. They need a different design entirely, something that does not argue, does not react, but simply does not move. And once that is in place, everything else either adjusts to it or disappears on its own. About 3 weeks after everything settled, I received something in the mail that told me the situation had moved from quiet acceptance to something more official, not aggressive, not threatening. Just a standard envelope with the HOA letterhead printed neatly in the corner, the kind of envelope that usually carries rules, reminders, or requests dressed up as obligations. I opened it at the workbench, the paper crisp, the ink still sharp, and it outlined a proposal, not a demand, a proposal to formalize access agreements along the subdivision boundary, language carefully chosen, words like mutual benefit and cooperative access placed in just the right spots to make it sound reasonable, like something that had always been meant to happen. And I read through it once, then again, slower, noticing what was not there just as much as what was. No mention of past use, no acknowledgement of the repeated crossings, just a clean attempt to redefine the situation moving forward. I set the paper down next to the old folder that had once held all my evidence. And for a moment I considered it, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand what accepting something like that would mean. And the answer was simple: it would turn a line that was already clear into something negotiable, something that could shift again later. And I had already seen where that kind of flexibility led. I did not respond right away. I walked the property instead, same path I had taken dozens of times before, boots pressing into ground that had fully recovered now, the faint trace of the old track almost completely gone, replaced by uneven grass and natural texture, the way it had always been. And when I reached the gate, I stopped for a moment, hand resting on the wood, feeling the solid structure beneath it, the part no one could see but everyone now respected. And that was when the decision became clear without needing to think it through any further. I went back inside, sat down at the same bench, and wrote a short response. Nothing complicated, just a clear statement that the property line remained private, that no access agreement was being granted, and that any future requests would be handled through proper legal channels if necessary, straightforward, consistent with everything that had already been established, and I sent it back the same day. After that, there were no more letters, no follow-ups, no attempts to revisit the conversation, just silence from that side. And that silence carried more weight than anything written on paper because it meant the proposal had not been a position of strength. It had been a test to see if the situation could be shifted back into something flexible, and when it was not, there was nothing left to push. The ranch continued the way it should have from the beginning. Mornings quiet, the air still carrying that mix of dry grass and cedar, the gate standing exactly where it belonged, not as a statement, not as a challenge, but simply as a fact. And I found myself appreciating that more than anything else, the absence of conflict, the return to something simple and consistent. Every now and then I would catch a glimpse of movement along the subdivision edge. People walking, cars passing on their own roads, everything staying within its own lines. And there was a kind of balance to it that had not been there before, not because anything new had been created, but because something that should never have shifted in the first place had finally been set back where it belonged. And once that happened, there was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to prove, just a boundary that meant what it was supposed to mean and stayed that way. By the time the season shifted and the air started to cool just enough to take the edge off the Texas heat, the whole thing felt like something that had happened a long time ago, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer had any place in the way things worked day to day. And that is how you know something is truly over, not when it stops, but when it no longer needs your attention to stay that way. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings where the only sound was wind moving across the pasture and the occasional distant truck on the county road. Evenings where the lights stretched low across the fence line and everything stayed exactly where it belonged. No surprises, no adjustments, just consistency. And I found myself noticing small things again. The way the ground felt under my boots in different spots, the slight variations in color where grass had grown back stronger, the way the gate cast a shadow that lined up perfectly with the post as the sun dropped, details that had been there all along but had been drowned out by everything else. I kept the structure exactly as it was, never changing what could not be seen, because that was never the point. The point was that it did not need to change again. And over time, even the idea of it being different faded, until it was just another part of the property, as natural as the fence line or the ridge beyond it. People stopped mentioning it altogether. No more passing comments, no more curious looks toward the back of the land. Just normal conversations about weather, work, and the usual things that fill space when nothing is out of place. And that shift in conversation told me more than anything else, because it meant the situation had not just been resolved, it had been absorbed into what everyone now understood as normal. I saw Brenda once more, months later, at a distance along the edge of her subdivision, walking with someone I did not recognize, her posture still controlled, her presence still polished, but she did not look toward the gate, did not acknowledge that part of the boundary at all, and that absence of attention was the final confirmation, not avoidance, not defeat, just acceptance of something that was no longer negotiable. Standing out there one evening, with the last light settling across the land and the quiet stretching out in every direction, I thought about how close this had come to becoming something ongoing, something that could have dragged on through paperwork, arguments, and endless back and forth, and how Easily, it could have stayed that way if I had kept trying to meet it on the same terms it started with, fixing what was broken instead of changing what caused it to break. But in the end, it was never about winning anything or proving a point. It was about understanding that some lines are not meant to be argued over. They are meant to be built into something that does not move, something that does not explain itself, something that simply exists and stays exactly where it is supposed to be. And once that is in place, everything else either adjusts to it or stays on the other side of it. And out here, that is all a boundary ever needed to be.